the big news story dominating across the world, that President al-Assad has finally, Bashar al-Assad has fled Syria after nearly 4 years of tyrannical rule through a mesh of underground tunnels. I've seen so much footage of poor people being released from prison. They reckon more than, but the comment was 600,000 people, his own people, he's gassed or murdered. It potentially is even more. Delighted to welcome, I hope I get this right, Con Coughlin, the Defence and Foreign Affairs editor of The Telegraph and author, actually, of Assad, The Triumph of Tyranny. Con, a very good evening. Welcome to Talk Drive. How are you?
Good evening. Good to be with you, Jeremy.
Bashar al-Assad, the second-choice dictator who could never fill his father's shoes, written by you. Tell us more about the man, because the world has rightly recoiled in horror and celebrated that he's gone. How did he last for so long?
Well, good question. I mean, when he first became president, nobody in Syria gave him a chance. He was the second son of the founder of the Assad dynasty, Hafez al-Assad, and he was actually training for a career as an ophthalmic surgeon in London. And he's tall, diffident, had a lisp, and really had no great physical presence. But then his elder brother, who was supposed to be groomed for the president, killed himself in a car crash. He was a bit of a playboy. And Bashar was parachuted back to Damascus and sort of given a crash course in how to become a dictator. And it's quite interesting because when he first became the president of Syria in 2000, a lot of people, including Tony Blair, bought into this shtick that he was going to be a great pro-democracy reformer. He was invited to London. He and his wife even had tea with the Queen at Buckingham Palace. I mean, this is how we fell over ourselves to befriend him. And then, of course, when the civil war broke out in Syria in 2011, he showed his true colours, and he said in your introduction, you know, he's personally responsible for the deaths of in excess of 500,000 people. And today, you know, the world is seeing for the first time what's been going on in the prison system in Syria, where people have been executed and tortured on an industrial scale and at his behest. So in my mind, and I write this at length in the book about this, he's a war criminal and should stand trial for war crimes.
Very interesting. We talk, I mean, I don't want to get into too much detail. I'm more interested about the book, but of course everybody's saying that the fall of Assad could cause a serious spike in threats across Europe, and then you look at Syria as a country, Con, and you think there are so many different factions, and I'm not militarily switched on that much, but I would suspect that when you've got 4 or 5 different factions, religious groups, whatever, political persuasions, the only way for that to be controlled is a dictator who's got more force than all of them and keeps them in check by murdering people who disagrees with him. It's an extraordinary. It's not rocket science, is it? I find it astonishing that he was at university. So a man that went to college in London became a dictator.
It is a remarkable transformation, and it just shows that, you know, it's in his genes. You know, the Assad family were poor mountain folk in Syria, and came into Damascus, seized power, and stayed in power by brutalising the people. And he was
obviously propped up. We know this by I'm going to call them the mad mullahs of Iran and Russia. We'll talk about Russia in a sec, but the mad mullahs of Iran haven't had a particularly good 3 months. When we consider Israel taking on that terrorist group Hamas, when we consider the problems trying to deal with the Houthis and Hezbollah as well. Bear in mind that those were their sort of proxy terrorist groups, and also that Assad was a voice for them. Do you think this will have an impact on the mad mullahs of Iran? Do you think they will suddenly become a little bit more isolated on the international stage?
Well, you put their predicament very well, Jeremy, and I actually think that, you know, this could be curtains for the Ayatollahs in Tehran, because, you know, they built this very extensive terrorist network throughout the Middle East, and you've mentioned Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, and there are militias in Iraq, and they basically sponsor terrorism around the world. And that terrorist infrastructure relied very heavily on the support of the Assad regime. The Assad regime in Damascus let Iran ship all its missiles and weapons to southern Lebanon to attack Israel. There are also Iranian bases in Syria itself. All of this has now been destroyed. Iran will struggle not only to maintain this terrorist infrastructure around the region, and of course they have terrorist outlets in Europe and elsewhere as well, here in London. But they will struggle not only to sustain this, but also a lot of people in Iran saying, well, you spent billions and billions of dollars on this exercise. Now it's all in ruins. We've got inflation at 30% plus, mass youth unemployment. You know, perhaps it's time for a new regime.
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it, that when regimes, you know, I'm old enough to remember the Berlin Wall coming down, when regimes that have been dictatorial or so appalling for so long, you think of Russia to a degree, that man's going to ring me and say, I don't know what I'm talking about, Vladimir Putin's a nice guy, I always ring. For me, one of the greatest things in the last few years is to see the people in these situations, whether they get confidence or strength from other countries, suddenly there's a sort of wave. Now, in a dictatorship, of course, if a dictatorship runs the media in the country, then people are told, certainly in Russia, only what the government or the dictator wants them to hear. But you do sort of feel that if places like Syria can and hopefully the peace will happen. I don't know, it's going to be a difficult time. But you certainly think, don't you, that if that can happen there, it could almost happen anywhere, because people are, well, revitalised and energised when they see that sort of thing happening, be it to Saddam Hussein, be it today. I think it's a positive for the world. But, of course, everybody is saying this could cause a serious spike to ISIS in Europe. There's going to be all these different factions arguing, and it's going to be a difficult time. But for me, there is a positive that people like Assad are no longer around in the world running countries and destroying people's lives.
Well, first of all, I think that the people of Syria are delighted. I've been talking to some of my Syrian friends and contacts, and they're over the moon to see the back of Bashar al-Assad. And the reason his regime collapsed is that the army that kept him in power basically ran away. They'd had enough. You know, while he was collecting cars and chandeliers and amassing billions of dollars in Swiss bank accounts, the average officer in the Syrian army was paid $30 a month, right? So they're told to fight, and they say, we've had enough of this. You look at Russia, and you look at the terrible toll the war in Ukraine's taken on the Russian military with these meat grinder tactics, 2,000 people dying a day for nothing. And at some point, you know, the worm turns and the military says, well, we're not putting up with this anymore. The same in Iran. So this is how dictators fall. So watch this space, Jeremy.
Really interesting. And the book, The Triumph of Tyranny, how long has it been out for?
It came out last year. Available in all good bookshops, just come out in paperback.
Good man. Really good to speak to you. And do you obviously watch the situation and I mean, I find it astonishing as well. His wife, who's turned out to be, you know, she was heralded initially. I was reading last night. She came from England and was working for JP Morgan apparently, and went there and didn't wear a veil and was lauded as this sort of westernised woman who was going to give Muslim women the chance. She turned out to be as bad as him, didn't she?
Yeah, I think they just live in a parallel universe. I mean, when I was researching the book, she grew up in Acton in West London, and I spoke to some of her neighbours, and she was almost like an English Rose, a sort of Syrian English Rose. She played tennis and went to nice schools and had nice manners and was very polite. And then she marries this dictator, and they go to Damascus, and while the whole country burns, you know, she's on the internet buying chandeliers and Christian Louboutin shoes and all the rest of it. So, I mean, it's just madness how these people change.
And it's also interesting, isn't it, with the dictator, just to finish, seeing the footage, Con, over the weekend about the palace being ransacked by the people, the Syrian people, and then seeing this labyrinth of tunnels and his Ferraris and bags of Louis Vuitton and stuff like that. And you think, so essentially, at the end of the day, you're just a bully with the army, and you're raping and pillaging your country for all you can get until, in the end, you have to leave. And when you leave, the Russians give you asylum. How do you see that going? Do you think the Russians will allow him to continue? Do you think somebody will take him out?
Well, I think yeah, Putin and Assad will reach an accommodation. I think Putin will want Assad to pay his way. So, you know, all these billions he's got stashed away in Switzerland may find their way into Putin's own bank accounts. I mean, this is how they operate. I imagine ultimately the Assads will find themselves relocated somewhere in the Arab world. I don't think they feel very comfortable in Russia, but for the moment, it's all they've got. So, and you know, they're lucky to have that, because if they were still at large, they'd be hunted down and killed by the Syrian people, or brought to trial for war crimes, which is what should happen to them.
Real pleasure to speak to you. I'm going to grab the book and have a read. Thank you very much indeed. Con Coughlin, Defence and Foreign Affairs editor for the Daily Telegraph and author